The first IGS Early Career Research seminar series of the term. I'm Michael Shaheen. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Pennsylvania and an affiliate research scientist at the Center for Remote Sensing of Integrated Systems at the University of Kansas. And yeah, I'm so happy to see so many people show up today and support the ECR group. And this is also hosted through the IGS's Early Career Glaciology group, EGG for short. And if you would like to be involved with EGG, please get in touch with me or go to the IGS website and find the EGG information there. Some housekeeping rules before we start with our speakers today. So the ECR series has three speakers, and each speaker is giving a about 15-minute time slot for their talks. And then we have one large Q&A at the end for about 15 minutes. So if you have a question during the talk, if you don't want to forget it, please put it in the chat, and then we could get to that at the end of the Q&A. And this is also going to be recorded on the IGS's, we're going to be recorded and uploaded to the IGS YouTube account, so people could watch later. And for the comments in the chat, I would prefer either the questioner to speak to that question out loud so the YouTube audience could know what that question is, or I could speak if you're not comfortable. So with that being said, I'm very happy to invite Mikayla to give our first talk. Mikayla is a PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin, and Mikayla's interests include understanding ice sediment interactions on different spatial and temporal timescales, utilizing idealized and higher order models. Today, Mikayla will be presenting work from her PhD on the implications of tidewater glacier cycles existing for large glaciers outside of the Alaskan context, and a sneak peek into what she's currently working on, which is exploring relationships between observations of surface velocity with basal freeze-on processes. So with that being said, I'm happy to let Mikayla take the stage.
Thanks, Michael. Let me share my screen and put it in full mode. Can I get a thumbs up if everyone can see that? Cool, thanks. So yeah, thanks to the organizers for inviting me to present a bit of my work. As Michael said, I'm presenting work that I'm currently writing up for my first chapter in what I recently presented at AJU. So if y'all have seen that, here's a recap. And I will end with a little snippet of what I'm working on for my second chapter, and I'm hoping to actually receive some feedback from folks that are on the call today. So to start off the talk, I'm going to explore tidewater glacier cycles and what they look like in polar regions. In particular, can they exist outside of the Alaskan setting where it's been extensively studied? So tidewater glaciers or outlet glaciers are everywhere in Greenland. However, they are really diverse in terms of their behavior. One of the key ways that they differ is that some of them are in different phases of their tidewater glacier cycle. And a recent study by Elizabeth Fisher and Andy Oshwitten determined where modern Greenland glaciers are in the tidewater glacier cycle through different calving fluxes. And some of them are advancing, some of them retreating. And here is an example in central West Greenland, highlighted in the blue square, where you can see different sorts of tidewater glacier cycles happening. So there's some that are destabilizing, maybe off of a moraine, or currently in retreat or stable, or about to become stable. And so why is this the case? It's proposed that interactions with sediment can drive this behavior, and that occurs because glaciers build moraines. I think most people on this call are familiar with the idea that under glaciers, there may be the presence of soft till or sediment that is available for glaciers to move around and build up moraines in front of the terminus. This process can control glacier stability and moraine terminating glacier environments through cycles of advance and retreat, or formerly known as the tidewater glacier cycle. And so this animation is capturing that process. This is an ice sediment model created by Doug Brinkerhoff and others, and within this animation, it's a numerical representation of Taku Glacier. And so you'll see it advance and retreat, build up this moraine, change the topography, and in the bottom panel, you'll see where the terminus tracks over time, and you can see there's a slow advance and then a rapid retreat. And so how is this relevant to Greenland? How could this help us understand the diverse tidewater glacier behavior that we see? We follow the same ocean and sedimentation treatment in Brinkerhoff, but what I'm changing here and interested in is the bed topography and the surf mass balance. And so investigating different scenarios of SMB and bed topography, which represent a wide range of characteristics that we know exist in Greenland, and seeing how does the tidewater glacier cycle differ across many different settings. And so we create an ensemble with varying bed topography. And so those slopes are going to be on the x-axis, varying from shallow to steep. And then different surface mass balance flux gradients on the y-axis that represent a variety of outlet glacier environments globally. So I'll walk through a couple of examples of what these glaciers look like in this parameter space. In the upper left side of this plot, these glaciers are characterized by shallow bed slopes and high SMB flux gradients, which allow for a thicker glacier to form in the interior and advance further out into the fjord environment. Note that the x-axis is in kilometers, and the scale that we're modeling here is from the ice divide to the continental shelf. So just wanted to note that. Moving to the lower right side of the plot, you'll notice that we have a thinner glacier in the interior, but the terminus is not as advanced in the fjord compared to the previous environment due to the slope. And so these are two examples, and there's a wide parameter space. So to understand how the Tidewater Glacier cycle manifests in these different environments, we designed three experiments. The first here is a control, which we can think of as a typical ice model that doesn't include any sedimentation or erosion. And so in the top panel, we'll play a profile cross-section of this glacier evolving over time, and in the bottom is the corresponding ice volume. So all of our models start from an ice-free state and reach some stable point, and after that, it starts advancing, retreating. However, because this is the control, we don't have any sediment or bed change, and so it grows and gets to a steady point. And so all of these models run for 50,000 years. This next experiment is sediment only, so bed change is not occurring, but sediment is still being produced from erosion. The bed topography is just immediately replaced. And you'll notice in the bottom plot, we have these different fluctuations in ice volume, and these are the different characterizations of Tidewater Glacier cycles that I'm going to be talking about in a few slides. And when I mean frequent by frequency, I mean the differences between like our trough to peak that are visible in this one. And our final experiment, it's the combined, where we have both sediment and bed change on. You'll see that in the top plot, there is some eroded topography, which is different from the starting one that we've seen in the couple cases, last previous cases. And so this experiment you can think about represents the most realistic representation of glaciers that evolve over time, create sediment, and change their topography. Okay, so jumping into some results, we're interested in how different is the ice volume when you begin to change the system and start to include sediment. So here we're comparing the ice volume between the sediment only case and the control. And so most of the parameter space here shows that there's a larger percent of ice volume. So that means the presence of sediment alone allows for larger ice volumes to occur, aka when you have sediment, the glacier is allowed to advance further. And so we have more or a larger sediment or ice volume. However, when comparing ice volume between the combined and the sediment only case, there's a relatively smaller percent of ice volume. So the presence of bed change restricts the glacier from growing as large as the sediment only case, and that's due to the glacier eroding the bed topography, creating these over deepenings where it takes a longer time to fill up an empty basin and continue shoaling forward. So there's a relatively smaller ice volume. We calculated the average timing of the Tidewater Glacier cycles for the fully coupled experiment and find a variety of cycle durations and even parts of the parameter space where there are no Tidewater Glacier cycles produced, so here in gray. And so when we looked at the Alaska case in the very first couple of slides I showed, they were on the order of maybe 300 to 200 years. And here we're seeing on the order of 1,000, 2,000 to even up to 20,000 years. So this is an order of magnitude larger or longer than what we see for the Tidewater Glacier cycle in Alaska. And so this map represents the average of the Tidewater Glacier cycle frequency. So I want to show a few examples of how these cycles look over time and across the parameter space. So we have three different panels of ice volume over time, and each panel has different characteristics within their peaks or Tidewater Glacier cycles. Here in the top, we have a non-uniform Tidewater Glacier cycle. This one is found in a high SMB shallow bed slope environment, and you might notice that there's a slightly decreasing trend over time, and there are different amplitudes and also frequencies of the Tidewater Glacier cycle. Here in the bottom two plots, I kind of classify these as a uniform Tidewater Glacier cycle where we sort of see the same behavior over time. And you'll notice that the magnitude and timing is different between the two of these, where this one is sort of these short, frequent cycles. And in the bottom panel, we have these long Tidewater Glacier cycles. And so the last thing I want to point out is that these are only three examples from a rich parameter space. And so what I'm writing up in a manuscript right now discusses the differences across the entire parameter space. Finally, we observe a climate and slope gradient when looking at the total area eroded in the fully coupled model. And so I want you guys to think of how this plot might represent how much the bed has changed from the beginning of the simulation and then where we see stuff in the end. And so here we see that the most bed change is happening in temperate, shallow topography environments, which agrees with previous research that the most erosive environments are those in temperate environments. And future work will hopefully be transforming this result into a basin average erosion rate, which can be used to compare our results in this parameter space to the literature. And so, key takeaways from this first part of my chapter and my dissertation. In this parameter space, we found that there's a wide variety of tidal to glacier cycles, ranging from about 1,000 years in terms of frequency, and as large as 20,000 years. And so, when we think about these cycles from an observational and maybe paleo perspective, we need to be mindful of the internal variability or force variability that can cause oscillations. And so, future work would be comparing this to other sediment. Sediment observations around Greenland to infer something about maybe if ice rafted debris can tell us about previous or longer tower glacier cycles. So that's the first half. I'm going to switch into the second part of my talk, which is still within the theme of basal processes, but in particular, I'm interested in investigating the impact of basal frisson and basal processes in general and the impact that it might have on seasonal glacier dynamics. So there was a great picture of basal frisson in the slide that I showed before, so I'm going to break it down. In August of 2024, I was a part of a research expedition to central West Greenland, denoted here in the red star, where we're interested in investigating the impact of sedimentation on terminus stability. And so my advisor, Ginny Catania, gave an AGU talk that discussed the range of observations that came out of this field campaign. So I encourage you to reach out to Ginny or myself if you're interested in any of that work. However, we observed a major calving event at Kingerlussuaq, and what you see on this slide is an annotated drone image of an iceberg from the calving event, and we immediately saw this rich basal layer. And so we can see distinct features such as rills, and also this rich basal layer where we have like different textures. And we estimate the size of this debris layer to be about 40 meters. And so we're curious how such a thick layer that is a little less than maybe like a third of the entire terminus face can form and contribute to a glacier stability. At Kingerlussuaq, there's a unique velocity pattern within the satellite era. And so this plot is showing a spatial time series of the velocity from 2010 to 2024 at this glacier. At the top is the terminus. So we have faster velocities up here and they're slower in the interior. And this is about 25 kilometers inland from the terminus. And so every 4 years, CAS exhibits these slowdowns that stick out by visual inspection, but we have also quantified these to be about 60% less than the annual average mean. In other words, these slowdown years are approximately a little bit more than half of the typical velocity that we might expect for, say, wintertime velocities. In addition to this velocity anomaly, CAS is remarkably stable in the satellite era in terms of its terminus position, so hasn't really moved much, maybe plus 500 meters, minus 500 meters in terms of seasonal advance and retreat. And so the potential for extensive frisson and the combination of these anomalous slowdown years might be contributing to the glacier stability as we hypothesize. So can we explain maybe some of these observations that we're seeing of velocity through the process of frisson? So a quick primer on basal frisson, so we're on the same page. Theorized by Richard Alley and others, the idea is that when you have sediment-rich basal water available, and you're sort of excavating all this water into the fjord, and if there is a large enough overdeepening, this water needs to maintain its pressure melting point, and so frisson occurs. And so we're thinking of the supercooling effect and also thinking about the observations that we're seeing in terms of a slower glacier velocity. And so as initial check, we're interested in saying, can we even see the signature in terms of a change in basal friction during an anomalous slowdown year? And so we're going to check that between a slowdown period and a regular year in ISSM and invert for the basal friction to match these two different velocities. And so that year I picked is 2020 and 2021. We use velocity from its live measures and also from Landsat, but right now what I'm going to show you are some images from Sentinel-2 as a kind of proof of concept. So when we do an inversion in ISSM and convert this into a basal friction equivalent, we have two different maps here of the basal friction state of CAS. And so on the left here, we're taking the difference between the friction in September of 2020 and June 2020. So what is like the peak velocity and that friction that maps it minus the fast or like least friction, and comparing that to a shutdown year, which we identify as 2021. And so we see that about 10 kilometers upstream from the terminus, where we hypothesize that there's an overdeepening for basal freeze-on to form, there's a substantial increase in friction. And so we did a bunch of other maps to see, are we seeing a real signal? And it is true. And so we think that it's localized here. And so our next step is, okay, let's try to think about modeling this in freeze-on. So we have a good initial check. We see that in order to match the slow velocity, the model requires a higher basal friction. But with higher basal stress and lower or slower ice velocity, does this mean that this is like the right condition for basal freeze-on? So we're in the middle of trying to figure out this problem in terms of, are we after the right mechanism to kind of explain, one, is there this large potential for freeze-on to happen coincidentally with these slower ice velocity observations? And so we could use a coupled subglacial hydrology model like Shakti to model the implications of freeze-on, but the setup is a little bit challenging. And so within ISSM and what we have already, we can determine what mechanisms might allow such an observation to exist. So we're thinking, or we have changed the rheology and surface slope, but we are getting these values that are really unrealistic in terms of the changes that need to happen within one season. So I would like to hear from other people about what you think we should also change or maybe get after in terms of linking these two observations. And so with that, I'm going to end from here. And so I'm excited to take any questions at the end of this.
Awesome. Amazing. Thank you, Mikayla. Lots of food for thought on the on what we should how to think about how to help you with that problem. Now, next to keep the ball rolling, we have Ishraque tuning in live from a cafe in New York. Very New York IGS egg vibe here. And today, Ishraque will be presenting on using the community ice sheet model CISM to reconstruct ice flow history in Antarctica's blue ice area. So if you're interested in the cold X blue ice stuff, this is a talk for you. Take it away, Ishraque.
Great. Thanks, Michael. I am in a coffee shop, so I apologize if I'm a little bit quiet on my mic. I will try to speak up so it's at least you can at least understand me. Um, Screen. All right. I hope everyone can see my screen. Um, yeah, perfect. So I'm going to be presenting on a part of my PhD research that's going on that coordinates the ice core analysis at the Center for Oldest Ice Exploration with using ice sheet models to better understand the ice core records that we're recovering. Um, a lot of the work that we do within Codex and even within my PhD is informed or inspired by the need for us to extend the Earth's climate record. And for this climate record, I specifically am talking about continuous climate records from ice cores, primarily because we have a lot of direct mapping capabilities. Usually, the continuous ice core record kind of fizzles out at around 800,000 years ago. Hopefully, beyond that, it lets us push it further back in time. But it's very hard to get an ice core record of Earth's atmosphere and climate stage beyond these 800,000 years in Antarctica. And so within Codex, we're trying to exploit this really cool mechanic that occurs in Antarctic ice even, and to an extent Greenland as well, which is blue ice areas. These are primarily regions near Antarctic's coast where there's no snow cover on the ice. So on the surface, you see blue glacial ice. And these are formed because of a combination of geomorphological and meteorological conditions where ablation is outpacing accumulation to basically preserve old ice. A lot of these locations are being formed because the ice flow in Antarctica is hitting a topographic barrier, which you see at the bottom here. And that essentially lets these blue ice areas act as conveyor belts for old ice or ice from the bottom of the ice sheet to appear near the surface. Um, This is quite convenient because it lets us kind of bypass a lot of the logistical troubles with drilling really deep ice cores in the interior and lets us recover really old ice cores records overall. So far, we've recovered ice core samples as old as 6.7 million years from Allen Hills, right here in northern Victoria Land in eastern Antarctica, near the Transantarctic Mountains. Um, and all of our analysis over the years has resulted in a pretty robust timeline of snapshot records that we can find through these Allen Hills ice cores. So in this plot in the background, we're seeing the benthic foram, Delta 18 records, and then overlaid on top are water ice foot records from snapshots of Allen Hills ice. So obviously, this is not a continuous record. These are slightly depth average snapshots of the past atmosphere, but the identifying factors of Allen Hills ice is that it let us go back pretty far back in time and have atmospheric records to analyze through it. Um, my project tries to understand why this happens to begin with. Um, why does Allen Hills do such a good job of preserving ice that's times older than what we would find in the interior of Eastern Antarctica? So my guiding questions have been these three, like what factors are contributing to such old ice preservation, and do all blue ice areas in Antarctica have the same potential for ice preservation? And to try to answer some of these questions, I'm working with the Land Ice Working Group at NCAR using the community ice sheet model. Um, Obviously, we're going to be running the community ice sheet model across Earth's history, and so we need a forcing scheme to basically mimic past climate change events. And I can talk about it more during the question and answer session, but overall, we're just using the Epicodome C and benthic stack records to interpolate climate states from all the way from 4 million years ago to the present to give our ice sheet model something to hold on to as it's evolving over time. But these runs are really long, and we expect the final production runs to take a long time to give us results. That doesn't mean we can't use the ice sheet model to still understand processes that trap old ice in Antarctica. So for preliminary testing, I've done a few spin-up runs, notably one that I've run for 12,000 years using standard ISNEP6 configuration at 8-kilometer resolution and 41 vertical signal levels. So the vertical layers are more dense near the bottom of the ice sheet. All of these runs are under constant modern climatology, and the ice age is being treated as a tracer. And the tracer transport is being done actively as the ice sheet evolved within CISM. And here are some results. So bear with me here. This is really ad hoc analysis of some of these results. So on the left, we're looking at the age of the ice at the 50-meter depth from the surface after this 12,000-year-old run. So after 12,000-year-old run, we expect ice to at most be 12,000-year-old. In Antarctica, that would be the maximum age we can expect in the ice sheet. On the right, we have vertical cross section. And immediately the thing that jumps out on this cross section is that most of the ice sheet is 12,000 year old. And that is not surprising. It's primarily because we started off with a solid age equals 0 Antarctica when we initiated this ice sheet run. So all of these layering of ice ages on the top here are what has been affected throughout these 12,000 year. But the distribution of these ice ages, even at the surface, can give us a good understanding of how blue ice areas are structured in Antarctica. This is why we're looking at ice at the surface, because that's where we recover a lot of the old ice that we find in Allen Hills and other blue ice areas. Same pattern can be seen in a cross section going grid west to east. And here is the ice age at 50-meter depths in the spin of run with existing blue ice area extents outlined around them. So I've selected three specific or pretty famous blue ice areas where meteorite sampling and blue ice sampling are being done or will be done in the future. So over here, we have the Victoria Lands where Allen Hill stands, and we can kind of see, if we squint a little bit, that the oldest ages, so the blue oldest ages on the surface, so near 12,000 years, the blue grid cells, do show up and collocate quite well with where we see blue ice areas existing in Antarctica right now. Um, and that is the most visible in these Victoria lands. That's not something, that's not a collocation relation we can discreetly or very confidently give for the other two blue ice areas in Prince Charles Mountains and Nansen and Yamato Mountains. There are patches of old ice near the surface that seem to be collocated with where the blue ice areas are in these regions, but they're not nearly as old at 50 meters depth as we would find in Victoria lands near Allen Hills. Here's an animation of how these surface ice ages have evolved over time. And even in this spin-up run, just looking at the average age evolution of the ice in these regions, we're starting to see that Victoria Land is uniquely capable of capturing old ice compared to the other two, Prince Charles Mountains and let's go back. Prince Charles Mountains and Nansen and Yamato Mountains together, which is already indicating to us that there might be a hierarchy of where to look for older ice if we start drilling in additional blue ice areas in Antarctica. Here's a closer look at the Victoria Lands blue ice area. The outline here is where Allen Hills is, and that notably stands in one of the oldest grid cells that exist near the surface in this region. And here's a comparative look of the Nansen and Yamato Mountains blue ice areas. And you can see the ice near the surface at 15-meter depth is not nearly as old as Victoria Lands, but there are patches of really old ice, for example, here and near the Soroden Mountains around outlined by this red circle. Notably, some of the oldest meteorites near the Nansen and Yamato Mountains are found exactly near this grid cell where we find a relatively older patch of ice near the surface, which is another confirmation that our model setup is probably not just representing relative age anomalies in blue ice areas in Victoria lands, but also in other blue ice areas across East Antarctica. That's been kind of our updates on this project so far. Obviously, work is underway in finishing this paleoforcing scheme and running a paleoclimate forced run of this H tracer experiment. Longer model runs are needed for H tracers to become truly useful because we want to get rid of that big chunk of initial ice that exists in these spin-up runs before we force them with climate change. And we're also planning on doing limited Lagrangian H tracer transports to compare our current incremental mapping H tracer scheme within CISM. The initial experiments with the H tracers are reaffirming the usefulness of high resolution CISM runs to better understand old ice preservation of blue ice areas. But more importantly, it's giving us additional insight into where productive ice core drilling should and can happen, and probably, and that's one of my targets, is to help bridge that logistical gap that exists in ice core drilling, especially for blue ice and results from ice sheet models. We're hoping to finish our production run of climate forced CISM using this H tracer for Antarctica at the same spatial scale for 8-kilometer grid cells from the last interglacial to the present soon. And then depending on the results we find from an for a climate forced run, we're going to start CISM run starting from 3 million years ago to the present. And that's going to be our final attempt at understanding how do blue ice areas evolve in an ice sheet model experiment across glacial and interglacial timescales. Yeah, thank you so much for your time. I want to specifically thank the National Center for Atmospheric Research and the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research for the funding, for funding this research, as well as the Center for Old Spice Exploration and NSF for kind of guiding a lot of these interdisciplinary work that is needed between us core scientists and glaciologists for work like this to happen. Thank you.
Absolutely phenomenal, Ishraq. Thank you so much for that presentation. And just a reminder that we have a Q&A at the end of the last talk. And third talk is Mansa. Mansa is a fourth-year PhD student at Dartmouth, and she is interested in numerical methods and leveraging deep learning techniques for ice sheet modeling. And today she will be presenting her work on inferring the subglacial bed topography using two conservation laws in a physics-informed machine learning framework. So a very nice thematic suite we have here for the ECRs, and please take it away, Mansa.
Thank you, Michael. That was a nice introduction. Let me start. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my slides? Okay, thank you. Thank you to the organizers for having me here today. It's very exciting to get to share some of this work that we're actually currently wrapping up and is currently in review. So a lot of the motivation for this project starts with Bed Machine Greenland, which, as we know, is an amalgamation of different types of methods, such as kriging and interpolation and mass conservation-based inverse methods to try and infer the ice thickness, and then the bed topography in between these ground truth ice penetrating radar measurements of the bed topography that we have. And this is a tool that is widely used by the ice sheet modeling community. However, it does have its limitations. One of the main limitations is that it's only constrained by mass conservation in these blue areas along the margins of the ice sheet where the ice is faster flowing. And the other limitation is that it's quite hard to apply this mass conservation-based inverse method in alpine landscapes. So you can see in the southeast of Greenland, the blue areas are quite small, and that's just because it's hard to apply this method there. And so what we thought was, well, we could try and use a different approach to extend the physics further inland and try and get at estimates of the ice thickness. And so for this work, we're interested in three main regions. For simplicity, we'll call them Upernavik, Narsep, and Deception, respectively. Upernavik is in the western part of Greenland. Narsep is towards the southwest, and Deception is by far the more complex alpine landscape from the southeast. And what we decided was we were going to try and use a physics-informed machine learning approach to infer the ice thickness in these regions. And so the setup here that we have, we have a fully connected neural network. And the setup is that it takes in X and Y coordinates as the spatial inputs, and it makes predictions of the velocity, the surface, elevation, the ice thickness, and so on and so forth. And the neural network will train itself with the help of a loss function, which describes essentially the overall error in predictions. And so this loss function will comprise of a data misfit, where you're comparing predictions to ground truth data, as well as a physical loss term, which is how we try to make the neural network enforce the physics. During the training process, the neural network will try and minimize the overall loss and update its weights accordingly. So following some of the work that's been done at Dartmouth, where we set up a package called Pinnacle, which is open source and available on GitHub. And initially, we set it up to be informed with stress balance or momentum conservation. And so in this setup, the neural network is taking in our spatial coordinates X and Y, and it's predicting the state variables of our momentum conservation equation. And in our loss function, we're comparing these predictions to ground truth velocity data, surface elevation data, and our sparse ice thickness data. And what we're also doing is that we are adding our stress balance residual to the loss function. So what's happening here is that we are taking our neural network predictions and plugging them into the stress balance residual. And if the neural network were satisfying the physics perfectly, this stress balance residual will be zero. And if it's not satisfying the physics perfectly, this will evaluate to some non-zero error term that's added to the overall loss or cost, which the neural network will then know that it has to do better and it has to minimize the error term here. And so with this setup, what we did was we focused on our deception region. So here I'm just grabbing the bed machine, bed topography for you for deception. And here is our neural network output or prediction. And here's the difference between these two bed topography maps. So as you can see right off the bat, there are some artifacts in this prediction. What's interesting is that it's picking out these interconnected troughs at the top. But as you might expect, when we plot our ground truth ice penetrating radar data or ground truth ice thickness measurements over these maps, you can see that the features that it's picking out are quite correlated to these flight tracks. You can see these interesting dips in the bed topography that may not be wholly realistic given our velocity maps. What is interesting here, though, especially visible in this difference map, is that we can see that the neural network is trying to conserve the momentum. It's created this large high area, but then it's trying to conserve momentum by creating this like dip in the bed. But for whatever reason, it's not really doing a good job at connecting between those observations. And so as another thought, well, as we were trying to compare it with bed machine, we thought we'd outline the mass conserving domain of bed machine, which is outlined here in black. And what we see is that the RMSEs within the mass conserving domain for bed machine are quite low, whereas the RMSEs outside of the mass conserving domain are on the higher side. Whereas for the pin, we see that these RMSEs are low overall, but it's like overfitting and it's predicting these features right where we have the data. And so we thought like another approach could be to try and change up our architecture, and instead of using the stress balance, we would instead use mass conservation. This meant that we had to change up our loss function. So we include a mass balance residual, and we also add in our apparent mass balance misfit, which is essentially just a linear combination of your basal and surface mass balances and ice thickening rates. And when we train this pin and plot up our results for deception, we see that the map also seems to have some artifacts. It is doing a slightly better job at inferring this trough in deception center north. And when we do plot our ground truth data over that, we do see that it's picking out these features or details that are highly correlated to the flight tracks. And that's when we decided, okay, well, let's revisit the drawing board and try and change up our architecture again. What's interesting here is that with this framework, we're actually able to use two conservation laws within our PIN framework. So we're adding more physics in the hopes that it'll be able to learn more of the information, especially in these areas where we have slower velocities of the ice. And with this framework, what we realized was it was actually picking up this nice interconnected network of troughs that are quite consistent with our ice velocity maps. And this intuitively makes sense because where you have a fast flowing ice stream, you would expect there to be a trough. And so this sort of lines up nicely. And when we plot our ground truth data over that, we see that the features are consistent with the data. The RMSEs are lower than bed machine, especially outside of this mass conserving domain. So some of the limitations is that within the mass conserving domain along the margin, we see that the pin is not quite able to pick out the full depth of this trough, but outside of this mass conserving domain, it is grabbing these troughs quite nicely. Um, and we thought, well, this was great. It seemed to be working outside of the mass conserving domain and sending the physics further inland. So we decided to test it on two other regions. We're here focusing on Upernavik and Narsep, where for Upernavik, we have lots of ice penetrating radar data, and for Narsep, where we have less ice penetrating radar data. And so for Upernavik, the results for the bed machine bed topography and the pin predicted bed topography were quite similar, as you can see from the difference map. And if we were to plot our data over that, we can see that the pin RMSE is actually lower. And it is picking up some interesting features. So, for example, this trough from Upernavik Istrom North is extended well into the ice sheet, well, further into the ice sheet, not well into the ice sheet. And it's connecting this trough at the top over here, which bed machine does not seem to be doing. But it is missing a couple of things too. For instance, here, it's not quite connecting the trough. It's very close, but it's not quite gotten that. Um, and this area we thought was an interesting area to explore because bed machine actually applies a mass conserving approach for this entire region. And so it was like a good sanity check to see whether our pin was actually reinforcing the physics or not. And for NARCEP, our results were quite different than that of bed machine. If we were to plot our data on top of that, we actually see that it's picking out these glacial valley-like features outside of this mass conserving domain where it doesn't seem to be doing the same. Similar to our deception case, it's not quite picking out the full depth of these troughs with the fast-flowing ice, but it is doing a pretty decent job outside of these mass conserving domains, as we can see from our RMSEs. Now, a lot of people have been asking how I validate this, and well, the validation is done with Upernavik because we have a lot of ice thickness measurements there, and we also know that bed machine uses a mass conserving approach for this entire region, so we can be pretty confident that we know what the bed topography is in that area. Um, and so what we did was we hid a lot of the ice penetrating radar data from the pin during the training process. We only trained it with the ice penetrating radar flight tracks that are colored in black. The hidden tracks are in cyan, and we removed most of the information along Upernavik Istrom North. So the idea was that if it could infer that there was a trough there, then the model would be doing a good job. And when we did that and plotted up our results, we do actually see that the pin is picking out a trough there, which we thought was great. It's still picking up the trough that is extended further inland, and it's picking up on that connected trough. Similar to our previous model, it's not quite grabbing the southern fork. It's not quite connecting the southern fork of Upernavik Istrom North, but it is, again, very, very close. As a sanity check, we also calculated our RMSEs, and what we found was along the training data, the pin RMSEs were lower than that of bed machines, but along the hidden data, the pin RMSEs were higher than that of bed machines, which does make sense because bed machine has seen all of these data, but the pin has only seen some of this data, and so it's not really doing as good of a job along those hidden flight tracks. And that sort of brings us to the end of this talk. The preprint is available if you'd like for more details, but just to conclude, we were able to constrain the pin with both mass conservation and momentum conservation because the pin provides this flexible framework. We do see new bed topography details for deception and RCEP, especially outside of the mass conserving domain for bed machine. And we're currently working on trying to extend this method to the interior of the Greenland ice sheet, which may require higher order stress balance included PDE residuals in our pin. And we definitely would like for a lot of feedback as we're doing that. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mansa. And perfect timing. We now have, well, first, let's just give everyone a round of applause for three amazing ECR talks. And now we have a 15-minute Q&A. Does anyone have a question for any of the speakers today? With a lot of applause. So, oh, Kevin, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, great job, all three of you. Monsa, I have a question for you. So I was just kind of surprised by how much better the second and third areas did as far as like your RMSEs. Um, and so I was wondering, what do you think we need to do, or like ideally, what would we have more for that deception area? Like, do we need more observation campaigns, or is there something just unique to the topography of that region that makes it so challenging?
I think that it is a complex alpine landscape, which is what makes it harder. You've got these regions of fast flowing ice, and in between that, you have slower moving ice. Um, I won't say no to more campaigns to get more ice thickness measurements. That always helps. But I do think it is a tricky area to try and for the ice thickness there.
Yep. I think so. We have a question in the chat first. Trevor, would you like to speak your question so the YouTube audience could know?
Oh, hello. Well, thanks for a very interesting talk. I can't say I followed it all, but I'm interested in how Greenland will deglaciate. So to understand that, we need to understand the bedrock topography. So my question is, what is now the best topographic map that we have for the whole of Greenland?
Is this a question for me? I'm assuming.
For Mansa.
Yeah. I would say bed machine, Greenland for Greenland. I think the margins are pretty accurate because in bed machine we're able to use a mass conserving approach there, and that's where a lot of the movement is happening right now. In the long run, the interior will become important, and knowing the bed topography there will become more important. But in runs right now, where we have a good idea with mass conservation of what the bed is, I think it's a really good map, and it's also widely used by the ice sheet modeling community.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually in the short run, the way that Greenland will deglaciate is very important. So getting a model of the whole of the bedrock topography for Greenland as soon as possible, I think is urgent.
Tim, you've had your hand raised for a minute.
Yeah, great talks by all three. I'll start with Mansa again. You had a lot more roughness in sort of the interior portions of your domains that you looked at than Bed Machine has, which like looks totally realistic. But I wonder how strongly that roughness is constrained. Like, is there a lot of uncertainty on the roughness? Could you have something like different realizations of that roughness that give about the same match to your data? And could you actually like sample different realizations?
Um, I actually I'm going to say that I think the roughness is because of the surface, because the way we calculate the bed elevation is because we take the surface elevation and we subtract the ice thickness. I actually think that the pin predictions of the ice thickness and the bed machine ice thickness values are pretty smooth in general, and they're pretty comparable to each other. And the reason they're smooth is because of the architecture of the pin. Like we are adding essentially three regularization terms in terms of the physics into our cost function. And there have been a lot of cities that have tried to improve on the roughness. Um, I think that a promising approach. Alison Chartrand recently did a lot of like IFPA modeling, which is basically
Mhm.
taking what we see on the surface and kind of doing some physics to grab sort of details in the bedrock with that. And I think that could be a good way at grabbing more of the bed details that we would
Yeah.
need. Yeah, if that answers your question, Tim.
Yeah, there's like 8 questions there. So yeah, this is good. Thanks, Mansa.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? I have a question for Mikayla. Um, so Mikayla, for the last half of your talk, are you inferring a slide? Well, what sliding law are you using? Are you just assuming no sliding law?
We're assuming a bud sliding law. We thought about exploring different ones, but we just kept it simple for now. So yeah. But we yeah, in terms of other laws, we're interested in different calving laws maybe in terms of what might be propagating from the front. So we're thinking about height above flotation and also von Mises to explicitly see if a reduction in driving stress is also contributing to these slowdowns. So yeah, that's the about the extent.
Looks like Tim has another question.
Yeah, sorry for all the questions. Michaela, question for you. In your plots that had like your slope and your mass balance gradient, it looked like the erosion had this like non-monotonicity for high mass balance gradients, if that makes sense. Like the wet case, you had this kind of on the top of the plot, like this dip in the erosion rate for a certain moderate slope. Could you speak to if there's some like sort of like actual physics going on there or what's causing those?
Yeah. Are you talking about this one?
Yeah, so on the top of the plot in the middle, there's those like really light pink grid cells amongst the darker ones that kind of break the overall structure.
Yeah, so we're chopping this up into model instability. So
Mhm.
the issue with some of these runs, I actually have an updated version of this where it's a lot smoother, but these runs were cut short, so they didn't run the full 50,000 years, and so it's just calculating less ice volume, but it should be a seamless transition. So yeah, forgot to point that out, but thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. Thanks.
And we still have plenty of time for questions. I have one for Ishrak if no one else has one right now. So, Ishrak, it was really amazing to see how Allen Hill's like pretty well resolved using CISM. Have you ever compared it with other ice sheet models to see why? Maybe is it like is CISM special or is there I don't know something else going on?
So a lot of what makes CISM special for this specific problem has been that H tracers are baked into the model run itself. So CISM uses incremental remapping for all sorts of transports, and we've been able to sneak in age as another tracer in that remapping scheme. With most other iFleet models, you have to kind of do a full run and then use the 3D velocity fields to run a separate Lagrangian tracer, which is why we've found it hard to make a lot of these comparisons, at least with the age values themselves. The target would be to compare CISM results with Lagrangian tracer results for something like the parallel ice sheet model, or even regional full Stokes solvers. And then empirically, we're hoping to compare against Antarctica isochrons from combined ice core and radar return data.
That's amazing. Because I was kind of have another question thinking about that, like, because I know there's some work with doing like in glacial velocity using like traces in radar. I was wondering, I don't know, that just seems like a very cool like observational constraint that like in theoretically could be possible.
Yeah, we're hoping. I mean, we're still in the early stages of figuring out how to analyze some of these results. I believe this is the first time we've actually used the H tracer and CISM for like an actual study and not had it as a diagnostic variable. So we were like, I'm very much open to suggestions on what are other ways we can validate some of these results, especially since we're evolving Antarctica from the past to the present, and we want there to be some amount of it. Well, ideally, we wanted to agree with our present ice sheet age depth structure, but at least we wanted to be close.
Awesome. We have just a bit more time for questions if anyone has any last questions to ask the speakers. And if not, I would say this concludes our first ECR seminar series of the term. Thank you everyone for showing up. I think we had a great turnout. And we have a talk next week by Luke Zoot from the University of Wisconsin. And I believe Alan, there you go. Yep, and here it is Alan sharing his screen. Thank you. And examining how a glacial slip varies across different bed conditions. And this is at the same time, same day, well, same week, same day of the week, February 4th at 8 p.m. GMT. And I hope to see everyone there. And don't forget to look at the IGS YouTube channel for previous recordings as well. And with that, I thank everyone.